I worked 9 years for the Forest Service, and I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. Most of it made sense. That's the part people never believe when I start talking. So I lead with it now. The work was permits and bear lockers and storm closures. It was checking culverts after heavy rain and reminding families to hang their food and writing up the same incidents over and over. A twisted ankle, a dead phone, a camper who missed a pickup time and turned up embarrassed at a gas station 2 towns over. Ordinary problems with ordinary answers. I liked that about the job. You could explain almost everything if you were patient and you took notes. I'm telling you this because one posting didn't fit. 7 months, 1 closed sector, and a set of rules I still can't file under anything reasonable. I've had 8 years to think about it, and I've kept exactly 1 habit from that season. When I mail a letter, I always finish the last sentence completely. I never leave a word half-written. I'll explain why later. The transfer order came in spring. I didn't ask for it. Nobody asks for it. It was a single page assigning me to Cardwell Gap National Forest, Sector 9, the stretch old-timers called the Cinder Reach. It had burned in a wildfire in 1991 and never reopened. You won't find it on any public map. It isn't on the trail brochures. It isn't on the website. But it was on the internal duty roster, plain as anything, with a live staffing requirement. 1 ranger, full-time, 7-month rotation. When I mentioned it around the office, people got quiet in a way I noticed but couldn't name. Not scared. More like they'd stepped around the subject so many times it had worn a path. My supervisor called it a maintenance rotation. I asked maintenance of what in a place with no visitors and no open trails. And he said the sector needed a ranger present. And that was the answer. He said it kindly. He also didn't look at me when he said it. A closed sector that doesn't exist on any map, but still needs a living person there every day. I kept turning that over on the drive up. The man I was replacing was named Del Hargrove. When I pulled up to the little station at the end of the fire road, his truck was already loaded. Not being packed. Packed. Bedroll, gearbox, coffee maker, everything strapped down under a tarp, like he'd done it the night before and slept in an empty room. Del was easy to talk to. Competent, steady, not a spooked man at all. He walked me through the basics fast, the way you'd hand off a lawnmower. The gate, the shed, the register box, the radio. He kept it light. He said the sector ran itself if you let it, and he said it like a joke, but he wasn't smiling. The thing I noticed was the watch. He checked it 4 or 5 times while we talked, and each time he glanced west, toward where the sun would go down. Not the trail. Not me, the angle of the light. Then he handed me a single typed page, folded once, and said this was everything I'd need for the season. He told me he wanted to clear the gate before dark. It was barely 4 in the afternoon. I remember thinking that was a long buffer for a 20-minute drive. Before he left, he pointed me to the sector logbook on the desk and told me to sign in. Standard. Every posting has one. I opened it and found the last shift's final line, and I stopped. The entry ended in the middle of a word. It read, "The gate was stat," and then nothing. No period, no scratch out, no correction on the next line. The pen was still clipped to the page where the writing stopped, as if whoever wrote it had set it down for a second and simply never picked it up again. I looked up to ask Dell about it. He was already at the door, one hand on the frame. He said only one thing before he went. "You'll want to keep your entry short." Then he was gone. I heard his truck start, heard the gravel, heard it fade, and I was alone in a one-room station with an open logbook, a broken word, and a folded page of rules I hadn't read yet. I read the page that first night, at the desk, with the lamp on and the windows going dark. There were 5 rules, numbered 1 through 5, each written in plain field language. Rule 1 was about the gate. Rule 2 was about the register. Rule 3 was about the radio. Rule 4 was about the burn line. Rule 5 was about the water tower. I'll get to each of them, because each one earned its place the hard way, and I'd rather you meet them the way I did than all at once. What I want to tell you about now is the 6th line. Under Rule 5, there was a number 6. It was typed. It was spaced correctly, the same indentation as the others, the same margin. But there was no text beside it, just the number, and then blank paper to the bottom of the page. The 5 rules I could read didn't scare me. They read like caution notices. Boring, even. It was the 6th one, the one with nothing written after it, that I kept coming back to. Somebody had typed that number on purpose. You don't leave a numbered line empty by accident. You leave it empty because the rule isn't finished, or because it isn't yours to write. I told myself it was a formatting mistake. I didn't believe it, but I told myself. The next morning, over coffee, I read the list again, and something bothered me that I hadn't caught the night before. I'd written a lot of safety protocols in 9 years. I knew how they worked. A real rule describes a condition. Do not cross the 3rd creek crossing when the water is above the marked stone. Do not walk the north slope after a freeze because the snags come down. Do not approach a sow with cubs. The danger is a thing you can see or measure or smell coming. These weren't like that. Every single one of these rules was anchored to a time. Do this before dark. Log that at a set hour. Never be out after 2. It wasn't the terrain they were worried about. It was the clock. I told myself scheduling was just discipline. In a hazard zone, alone, you keep a tight routine so you don't get sloppy and hurt. That's true. I've believed harder things for worse reasons. But a spring-loaded gate doesn't care what time it is. Erosion doesn't check a watch. The more I looked at that list, the more it read like a duty schedule for something, not a set of warnings about a place. I didn't like where that thought went, so I put the page in the desk drawer and went to work. The posting itself was small and solid. 1 room to live and work in, a wood stove, a cot, the desk, the radio on a shelf. Out back stood a locked equipment shed and a dry water tower that hadn't held water in decades. At the end of the access road sat the padlocked gate that kept nobody out of a place nobody came to. And there was the burn line. That's what the old crews called it. It was the edge of the 1991 fire, a hard boundary where scorched, standing timber met the living forest. Except the living forest stopped there. It hadn't crossed. 30 years, and not one seedling had taken on the burned side of that line. On one side, spruce and rhododendron, ordinary and green. On the other, dead gray trunks and pale ash, and a straightness to the edge that no fire I'd ever seen leaves behind. I stood at that line the first full day and told myself it was soil chemistry. Fire changes the ground, alters the pH, sterilizes it for years. That's real. That happens, just not usually in a line you could follow with a ruler. I noted it, the way you note anything odd, and I went to check the gate. That's where Rule 1 starts. Rule 1 was the easiest to accept, which is exactly why I didn't take it seriously enough. It read, leave the gate open during daylight maintenance, but never be the one to close it after sunset. If it's still open when it's dark, walk away and leave it. Deal with it in the morning. The official reason, the one written in the margin in a different hand, was that the gate was heavy and spring-loaded, and closing it in low light was how a ranger working alone got a hand crushed or a wrist broken with no one around to help. That made perfect sense to me. I'd seen gate injuries. They're ugly, and they happen fast. A solo ranger being told not to wrestle heavy hardware in the dark is just good policy. So I filed Rule 1 under common sense and moved on. The problem, which I found the first time I actually put my hands on the gate, was the spring. It was rusted solid, locked up completely. That gate couldn't swing itself closed on the best day of its life, which made me wonder what the rule was really protecting me from, since it clearly wasn't a spring that hadn't moved in 20 years. For a while, nothing happened, and I settled into it. The days were quiet in a way I actually liked. I cleared the culvert under the access road. I checked the padlock on the shed. I did radio checks with a dispatch office 2 ridgelines away through a repeater that barely reached. There was a dead zone in the signal, and I found early that it sat right along the burn line, which I chalked up to the terrain and the dead timber and forgot about. Every day I left the gate open while I worked, and every evening, if I hadn't gotten to it, I let it stay open, per the rule. And nothing came of it. No trespassers, no hunters, no hikers who'd wandered off a map that didn't include this place. Just me, the fire road, the burned trees, and the sound of the creek I couldn't quite hear from the station. I'll be honest, I got comfortable. I started thinking of it as a lonely posting run by an overcautious office that had never let go of an old fear. That's the mistake. That's always the mistake. You get comfortable, and then the first thing arrives that doesn't fit, and you realize the quiet was never empty. It was just waiting for you to relax. It was a Tuesday, maybe 3 weeks in. I came out at first light to start the day, and the gate was shut. Not just shut, chained and locked, with the chain wrapped through the bars and secured on the inside face, the side I'd never been on after dark, because I always drove in during the day and worked from the station. I stood there and went through it the way I'd go through any incident. The spring hadn't moved. I checked, still seized, still rusted, still incapable of swinging that gate on its own. There were no fresh tire tracks in the mud from the night's dew. There were no boot prints anywhere except mine, and mine were from the day before, dried at the edges. Nobody had driven in. Nobody had walked in. And yet the gate I had left open was closed and chained from a side I hadn't touched. I took photographs, 3 of them on the department phone, time-stamped. Then I told myself the most reasonable thing I could build. A hunter had come through, closed the gate out of some backwoods courtesy, and left before the dew set. Thin, but possible. I unlocked the chain, swung the gate back open, and tried to let it go. I couldn't quite. It was the chain that stayed with me. Whoever had secured it hadn't just looped it and snapped the lock. They'd finished it with a knot. A specific one, doubled back on itself in a way I'd never tie. A way that took an extra second and a habit to make. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Later that day, I went to the equipment shed to get a tool, and I stopped again. The shed's chain, the one the previous ranger had used to secure it, was finished with the exact same knot, same doubling, same extra loop. A signature, the way handwriting is a signature. Dell's knot. The man who'd been gone for 3 weeks, whose truck I'd watched drive down that fire road and disappear. His knot, on a gate I'd been told never to close, tied sometime in the night while I slept 100 feet away. I didn't write it in the logbook. I remembered what he'd said about keeping entries short, and for the first time, I thought I understood him a little. I kept the photograph. I said nothing to anyone. And I started reading the second rule a lot more carefully than I'd read the first. Rule 2 was about the visitor register, and on paper, it was almost funny. It read, "Stamp and date the register every evening before sunset, whether or not anyone has signed it." And below that, in the same margin hand as before, a second line, "Never read entries made after your stamp." The official reason was liability. If a closed sector ever came up in a review, the register proved it was patrolled daily, stamped by a real ranger, documented. Fine. Bureaucracy does stranger things than that to cover itself. It was the second line that stuck. Never read entries made after your stamp, which meant the office expected there to be entries after the stamp. In a sector with no legal visitors, no open trails, and a padlocked gate, they expected people to sign in after I'd closed the book for the day, and they were telling me not to look. I told myself it was boilerplate, some clause copied from an old form. I decided to follow it because it cost me nothing. I broke it inside a week. I'm going to tell you what I read, because there's no point pretending I didn't. For the first several days, stamping the register felt like the most pointless thing I did. The register was a standard trailhead sign-in box, the kind you see at any backcountry entrance. Waterproofed, bolted to a wooden post at the old trailhead just inside the closure, a sheet metal cap over a hinged lid. Inside, a bound register and a pen on a string. I'd hike the half-mile to it, open the lid, stamp the current page with the date, close it, and hike back. Every page blank. Every day. I felt like a man saluting an empty room. Then, one evening, I did the same thing I always did. Stamped it, closed the lid, latched it, walked back to the station in the last of the light. Nothing unusual. I slept fine. The next morning I hiked out before my new stamp, opened the box, and there were 3 lines of handwriting above yesterday's mark. 3 entries, made in the window between my stamp and the dawn. In a box bolted shut, behind a latched lid, on a trail no one could reach, in a sector closed for 30 years. 3 lines of neat, ordinary handwriting, written sometime in the dark. I read them. Of course I read them. I'd broken smaller rules for worse reasons. Each entry was normal in form. A full name, a party size, a destination. The kind of thing anybody writes at a trailhead, so that if they don't come back, someone knows where to look. The handwriting was steady, ordinary. 3 different hands, if I had to guess. The only thing wrong was the destinations. Each one named a place inside the burn scar, a meadow, a shelter, a pool below a falls. Places that, as far as I knew, had burned to nothing in 1991 and never come back. People signing in to go somewhere that no longer existed. I photographed the page. Then I did the reasonable thing, the thing I told myself a trespasser was making necessary. I decided a person was messing with a closed sector, coming in at night, writing fake entries as some kind of prank on whatever poor ranger drew the rotation. But the analyst in me wouldn't let one thing go. The names. They were specific, real sounding. On my next day off, I drove down to the county library and sat at the microfilm reader and looked them up. I wanted to prove they were nothing. They weren't nothing. Every name in that register belonged to someone reported missing near Cardwell Gap. Not all at once, across decades. I found the first in a newspaper from the late 70s, before the fire, a hiker who never came back. I found another from the 90s and one from just 8 years ago. Different years, different people, no connection between them, except the place they were last seen. And when I checked the dates against the register, my stomach did something I didn't have a word for. Each register entry was dated the exact day that person had gone missing. Not the day the entry appeared in my box. The original day. Someone had walked into a padlocked sector overnight and signed the register as those people, on the dates they vanished, headed for places that burned to ash years before some of them were even born. The register wasn't logging visitors. It never had been. It was logging arrivals. It was a record of people coming in, on their own original days, into a place that no longer held the destinations they'd written down. I turned off the microfilm reader. I drove back. That night, for the first time, I did not stamp the book. I want to be careful here, because this is where it stopped, being something I could explain to myself, and stayed explained. Rule 3 was about the radio. It read, "Keep the radio on at all times, but never transmit from inside the burn line." And a second part, "If you hear your own call sign answered when you did not call, do not reply." The official reason was the dead zone. The repeater's signal broke up along the burn line, and the theory was that it caused bounce, an echo, a garble of old traffic that could confuse a ranger into thinking someone was calling him. Signal artifacts. It's a real thing on bad repeaters. I'd heard it before, in other parks. I'd skipped my register stamp the night before. I keep coming back to that, because I don't know if it mattered. And not knowing is its own kind of... What I know is that at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, the radio on the shelf woke me up, and the voice on it was reading back my own call sign, and I had not touched it. I came up out of sleep the way you do when a sound is wrong before you're even conscious of it. The radio was talking. A flat voice, the cadence of a dispatcher reading off a form. No urgency in it at all. It acknowledged my call sign. Then it read back a set of coordinates, slow and clear, like it wanted to be sure I copied them correctly. I lay on the cot without moving. I had not keyed that radio. I hadn't gotten up. The voice waited, the way a real dispatcher waits for a response, and when none came, it repeated the coordinates once, and then it stopped, and the static came back over the shelf. I recognized the numbers. I'd been marking positions on my patrols, the way you do, and those coordinates were the burn line. Not near it, on it, to the decimal. I did what the rule said. I did not reply. I did not get up. I found a pen on the desk without turning on the lamp, and I wrote the time on the back of my hand, 2:11, because I remembered Dell telling me to keep my entry short, and I wasn't going to write this one at all. I lay there until the window went gray. In the morning, I drove out to the fringe station, the one place on the road where I could reach the automated dispatch archive and pull the overnight traffic. I told myself the log would be empty. Signal bounce doesn't record. An echo isn't a transmission. If the voice had been an artifact, there'd be nothing there, and I could go back to sleeping. The log was not empty. There it was, time-stamped 2:11 a.m., my call sign, duration 11 seconds, and beside it, an origin flag. The system logs where a transmission comes from when it can, and this one was flagged to the dead zone. The burn line, the exact stretch of terrain the repeater engineers had certified, in writing, as unable to pass a signal. I'd read the certification myself in the station binder. No signal in, no signal out. The hardware said no transmission could come from that spot. The log said one had 11 seconds long, at 11 past 2, under my own identity, while I lay awake on a cot, listening to it happen. I sat in the truck for a while. Then I did the thing that I'd been avoiding. I called dispatch and asked about it directly. The dispatcher who picked up was a veteran, 15 years on the desk at least, the kind who's heard everything and files it flat. I gave her the timestamp and my call sign and asked her to look at the entry from the dead zone. There was a pause, longer than a lookup should take. When she came back, her voice had changed, not scared, just careful. The way you get around a thing you've agreed not to poke. She told me the Sector 9 call sign was on a standing Do Not Acknowledge list. Any transmission from it was to be recorded but never answered. It was policy. It had been policy since before she started. She said nobody in the office knew who had put it there or when. It was just one of those instructions that outlived the people who wrote it, and everyone followed it because it was easier than asking. Then she said gently that if I were her son, she'd tell me to put in for a transfer. I thanked her for that. I meant it. And I didn't do it. Not yet. I told myself I wanted to understand it first, which is the exact thought that got Dell and the Ranger before Dell, and I didn't know that yet. She mentioned, before she hung up, the last Ranger who did transfer out. That's what sent me looking at who'd come before me. Rule 4 was the walk, the one I'd been doing every day without thinking about the wording. It read, walk the burn line once daily, always keeping the dead timber on your left. Never cross to the far side. Not to retrieve gear, not to help anyone, not for any reason. The official note in the margin was unstable snags and ash pits, which is a real hazard. Burned ground hides holes where root systems have turned to ash under the surface, and a standing dead tree can come down on a still day with no warning. Telling a solo ranger to keep clear of the burned side is sensible. But I'd read enough of these rules by now to hear the strange part. The rule didn't just say, "Stay out." It told me which shoulder to keep towards the dead trees. Dead timber on your left. Every time. Which meant, on that trail, I was always walking a direction that kept the burn to one side of me and never let me face it straight on. A rule about avoiding a hazard doesn't tell you how to hold your body. A rule about not being seen might. I wanted to ask someone who'd walked it longer than me, so I went looking for Del. It took a couple of calls through the office, but I found him. He'd been reassigned to a coastal park, a wet, flat, crowded place, about as far from the Cinder Reach as you can get without leaving the service. On the phone, he was cheerful. We talked about the coast, about the tourists, about nothing. And he was easy the whole time until I said Sector 9. Then the ease went out of him like air out of a tire. I asked him straight. I told him about the gate, and the knot on the shed, and the gate chain, and I asked if he'd tied it. He said he'd tied that knot on the shed for 2 seasons, his habit. And then I asked if he'd ever, one single time, closed the gate himself. He said no, not once. He'd followed the rule the whole time he was there. He'd never touched that gate after sunset. I said, "Then who tied your knot on it 3 weeks after you left?" The line went quiet. When he came back, his voice was low. He said, "The sector keeps you company out there, and the longer you stay, the bolder the company gets." Then he asked me how many rules I had left. That question sat wrong enough that I stopped asking Del things and started pulling records instead. At the fringe station, I could reach the personnel files, and I went through every ranger assigned to Sector 9 since the closure in 1991. What I found was a chain, one ranger at a time. Always one. They never overlapped more than a single day, the handoff day, the way Del and I had crossed for one afternoon. Never 2 people in there at once for any stretch. Never a crew. One person, alone, on rotation, for 30 years. Most of them transferred out within a season. A few months, and then a request to leave, approved fast, no questions. That fit what the dispatcher had told me, and what Del had done, and what she'd advised me to do. But 3 of them didn't transfer. 3 files just closed. No transfer order, no incident report, no explanation. The record simply ends. And when I lined up the closing dates, the thing I'd been building since the register snapped all the way into focus. All 3 closed in the same week of autumn. Different years, but the same 7 days on the calendar. The sector had a season, and I was, right then, 3 weeks out from it. There was an archived binder at the fringe station, the kind nobody opens, and in it I found the thing that started all of it. It was a memo, typed, dated a few days after the 1991 fire was declared contained. It described a 4-person survey crew sent in to assess the burn. It said, in the plain, awful language of an official document, that the crew did not return. that searchers went in after them, and that the only thing recovered was their radios, still transmitting from the dead zone. The memo established the response. From that point forward, Sector 9 would be staffed by a single rotating ranger, never a crew, and it laid out the rules. The gate, the register, the radio, the burn line, the tower. 5 of them, word for word the same as the page in my desk drawer. And then a phrase I have not been able to put down. The memo said the rules existed to minimize personnel exposure during scheduled activity. Scheduled activity, not fire suppression, not hazard mitigation. An activity with a schedule. And the way the memo was written, referencing it like a known thing, made it clear the schedule wasn't new in 1991. The fire hadn't caused this. The fire had just given them a reason to close the gate and write it down. Rule 5 was the last one on the list I could read, and by the time I truly understood it, I understood all of them. It read, never be outside the station between 2 and 2:30 in the morning during the autumn week. And if you hear water in the dry tower, do not look toward it. The official note said the empty tank groaned in the temperature swings of the season, expanding and contracting metal, and that a ranger, startled by the sound near unstable ground, could hurt himself in the dark. Reasonable, if you say it fast. But I'd stopped saying things fast. The autumn week, the window from 2 to 2:30. The radio had spoken to me at 2:11, inside that half-hour off-season, when I'd broken a different rule. The rule wasn't keeping me safe from a groaning tank. It was keeping me indoors, and it was keeping me from looking during the exact minutes when the register said arrivals came in. And the last part gave it away completely. If you hear water in the dry tower. That tank had been empty for decades. I'd checked it myself. There was no water in it, and no way for water to get into it. But the rule already knew I might hear some. I did the thing that ruins men out there, and I knew it was the thing that ruined them. And I did it anyway. The rule said, do not look toward the tower. It did not say, do not record it. That's the loophole, the same lawyerly reasoning that every one of us tells ourselves, the little gap you slip through because you can't stand not knowing. I'd read about camera loopholes in enough of these stories to recognize I was becoming one. It didn't stop me. I mounted a trail camera on a snag facing the tower's ladder, angled up at the tank, motion-triggered, infrared, time-stamped. Then I went inside, drew the one curtain over the window that faced that direction, and I stayed put during the window, eyes on the far wall. At 2:17, I heard it. Faint, but there, running water. The sound of a full pipe, of a tank with something moving through it, coming from a structure I had personally confirmed was bone dry. I did not look. I kept my eyes on the wall, on a knot in the pine boards, and I counted my own breathing until first light. And then I went out to pull the card. The card had 41 triggers on it. Every single one stamped 2:17 a.m. across the consecutive nights I'd had it running. I went through them on the station laptop, one at a time. Frame after frame was the same. The ladder, the tank, the pale ash ground at the base. Gray, still, empty. The infrared washed everything flat and colorless, and there was nothing in any of them. Nothing moving. Nothing there. I started to relax, 40 frames deep, telling myself the sound was the metal, after all, that the rule was old caution, and the camera proved it. Then the last frame. The ladder was occupied. Something on it, from the top rung down, at a height that matched the register box, a shape reading the way a person reads when they're partway up a ladder. It was oriented the way Rule 4 demands you never orient yourself. Turned so its front faced the burn line, and its back faced the lens. No face resolved. The infrared caught an outline, and nothing inside it. No features, no detail. Just presence where 40 frames had shown none. The next trigger, seconds later, was empty again. Whatever it was had come and gone in the space between two exposures. I couldn't leave it at a photograph. I went out to the tower in full daylight when the rule allowed it, and I looked at the ground. The ash held prints. Boots, roughly my size, pressed clean into the pale surface at the base of the ladder. And that was the thing that stopped me cold, standing there in the sun. The prints didn't come from anywhere. There was no approach, no line of steps crossing the ash toward the ladder, and none leading away. They started at the bottom rung, as if a person had simply begun existing on that spot, stood there, and stopped. Among the prints, half buried in the ash, I found two things. The first was a Forest Service pen, standard issue, the kind clipped to a logbook. The second was a single page, torn out of a logbook, folded once and pressed into the ground. I opened it. The handwriting wasn't mine and wasn't Dell's. It matched the ranger before Dell, the one whose file just closed. It was a normal shift entry. The gate, the weather, the register, ordinary words. And the last line ended mid-word. It stopped on ST. The same two letters. The same broken word I'd found in the logbook on my very first day. I took the page back to the station, and I sat down at the desk, and I pulled the folded rules out of the drawer to compare the handwriting. The 5 rules were there, same as always. And then I looked at line 6, the blank one, the one that had bothered me since the first night. It wasn't blank anymore. There was text beside the number now, typed in the same font as the rest, on a machine I did not own and did not have. My station had no typewriter. My laptop's printer was in a box I'd never unpacked. But there it was, freshly typed onto a page that had been in my locked desk drawer. It read, Rule 6, end your entries before the second hand reaches the top. I read it 4 or 5 times, and then I understood. I understood the logbook on my first day, the one that stopped mid-word. I understood the torn page in the ash, ending on the same 2 letters. I understood Dell telling me to keep my entry short. The rule was never about writing much or writing little. It was about the exact moment your writing had to stop, before the second hand reaches the top, before the minute turns. I want to lay it out the way it finally laid itself out for me that night, because it's the part I still can't shake. Every rule on that list kept the sector running smoothly. Leave the gate open, so the way in stays clear. Stamp the register, so the arrivals have a page to sign. Don't answer the radio, so nothing gets interrupted mid-schedule. Walk the burn line one way, so you never face what's working on the other side. Draw the curtain at 2:17, so you never see the thing on the ladder, and it never has to account for you seeing it. I had thought this whole time, that the rules were protecting me from the sector. They weren't. They were teaching me to service it, to keep it fed and unbothered and on time. The disappearances weren't the rules failing. The people in that register weren't victims of a system that broke down. They were the output. They were what the sector produced when everything ran the way it was supposed to. And I had been good at it. That's the part. I'd stamped the book. I'd kept the gate open. I'd walked the right direction and drawn the curtain. My diligence, the thing I was proud of in 9 years of clean reports, had made me a competent operator of the thing that took them. I opened the sector logbook then, because I wanted to write it down. All of it, for once. Completely. I wanted a full record, and I turned past the current page to find room. And I found something already there. 3 pages ahead of where I'd been writing, dated 4 days out, there was an entry. In my handwriting. My exact hand, my slant, the way I cross my letters. I had not written it. It described a routine shift, a calm one, the gate checked, the register stamped, the weather clear. Ordinary, careful, professional. My voice on paper. And it ended mid-word. It stopped before the sentence finished, the way the first one had, the way the torn page in the ash had, on a broken word with the pen laid down. The register logged arrivals. I'd worked that out at the library. But the logbook did something else. The logbook logged the ranger. Every one of them, in the end, wrote an entry that stopped mid-word, because that was the last thing they did. And mine was already written, 3 pages ahead, dated for a shift I had not worked yet, waiting for me to walk into it and make it true. I did the one thing none of them had done. I know that now, because I went back through every logbook in that station, and every final entry stops mid-word. Every single one. Except mine. The next morning, in full daylight, I filed a transfer request. I drove to the fringe station, and I sent it up the chain, and I did not wait for it to be approved. Then I came back, and I stamped the register one last time, and I sat down at the desk with the logbook open. And I wrote a complete entry. I wrote in full sentences. I described the day plainly. And when I got to the end, I did not stop before the second hand reached the top. I finished the sentence. I put a hard period at the end of it. I wrote my name under it, all of it, first and last, and I closed the book. Then I loaded my truck the way Dell had loaded his, everything strapped down. I left the gate standing open, because that was still the rule, and I saw no reason to test it on my way out. I did not tie the knot, and I drove down the fire road before 2 in the afternoon, hours of daylight ahead of me. For the first time in the sector's history, the logbook held a final entry that ended. That was 8 years ago. I transferred out clean. My paperwork went through. Sector 9 still shows a live staffing requirement on the internal roster. And someone else drew the rotation after me, and I've made my peace with not knowing who or what happened to them. I never learned what the sector is. I want to be honest about that, because people always want me to have an answer, and I don't. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses. What I believe is narrower and worse. I believe there is a schedule out there that outlived its excuse, that ran before the fire and ran after it, and that the rules were never protection. They were operating instructions, and I followed them well. I told you at the start that I kept one habit from that season. Here it is. When I write a letter, when I sign anything, when I fill out a form, I finish the last sentence completely. I put the period on it. I never leave a word half-written, and I never stop before the line is done. It's a small thing. It's a private refusal. I decided a long time ago that whatever else happens to me, my last entry is going to end. I thought that was the end of it. It should have been. It wasn't. A few months after I transferred out, an envelope came to my house. No return address, no postmark I recognized. Inside were two things. The first was my transfer paperwork, the approved copy, stamped and dated, the proof that I'd gotten out clean, that I was done, that it was over. The second was a photograph. It was the open sector logbook, laid flat on the desk I used to sit at. The lamplight I remembered falling across the page, and there was an entry in it, dated for a night after I left. After my last complete entry. After my name and my hard period and the closed book. It was in my handwriting, my exact hand. It described a routine shift I never worked, the gate checked, the register stamped, the weather clear. And it ended, of course, mid-word, the pen laid down beside it. The sentence stopped before the second hand reached the top. I keep the photograph in a drawer. I've never filed it. The sector kept my slot. I just tell myself, I'm not the one filling it. Most nights, I believe that. Not all of them.